Okay, so thank you for coming. So today I'll be talking to you about PivotTable.js, which is a JavaScript library that I put together. And I'm calling it an open source story because basically it's going to be the story of how I open sourced this project and some of the things that I learned while doing this. So just a few words about me. My name is Nicholas. I'm a software engineer at Datacratic. Datacratic is a startup. We're based here in Montreal. We've been around for about 5 years. Basically, we're a machine learning company. My role there today is I'm the product owner for MLDB, the machine learning database. And I encourage you guys to check it out because it's very cool, but that's not what I'm talking about here tonight. Tonight I'm talking about sort of my hobby, my passion, which is data visualization. PivotTable.js is the topic. What is it? This is what I have on the PivotTable.js website. It's a JavaScript pivot table library with drag and drop functionality built on top of jQuery and originally written in CoffeeScript. So let me just show you what it is and what it does, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the story. So demo time. So here we go. This is the PivotTable.js website, and one of the main demos of it is basically I've loaded up all of the data sets that come with the data analysis software R. R is a sort of an open source data analysis platform. It comes with about 700 data sets preloaded that people use, and so I'm going to use those for my demo. So the one that I find kind of neat to work with is a data set called the tips data set. So basically, sometime in 1995, there's a waiter who wrote down for a period of a few months some information about how much the total bill was for a meal and how much tip he got, and the gender of the person paying, the number of people at the table, whether it's lunchtime or evening or something like that, and the day. So this is basically the data set that we'll be looking at. And so this is a pivot table. Who here has seen a pivot table in Excel before? Yeah, so no, it's just a pivot table. It's not really a spreadsheet, right? It's just the table part. So here, what you can see is, I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger so it fits on the screen better. What you can see here is it says total 244. So by default, what the pivot table shows you is just the count here, the number of records in there. So I can take a look, and I told you that the waiter recorded the sex of the person who paid for the meal. And so if I put the sex here, all of a sudden it shows you the breakdown by gender. So you can see that in the data set, out of 244 meals, 87 were paid for by women and 157 were paid for by men, 1995. And some of the other dimensions, he also recorded whether anybody at the table was a smoker or not. So you can take the smoker dimension and you can put it across the top here, and you can see now that you have a 2D table, and so it's breaking things out by gender and by whether or not people are smoking, which is kind of neat. And you can also move things around, so you can take the sex and put it over here. And so now you have kind of a hierarchical view. And you can look and see more and more data. You're kind of slicing and dicing the data. Now you can see the day. So you can see how many meals there were by day, by gender, who paid, by gender. So you can start to get a sense of what you can do with the pivot table. I'm just making these tables over and over. But you can display other things than just the number of rows which match the different attributes. So what you can do is you can, what this guy is interested in clearly is his tips, right? So let's take a look at the sum. And the table's disappeared because I need to choose something. The sum of the tips. So now you have the actual total amount. So you can see that in total, in the data set, he had $731 worth of tips. And you can sort of see how that breaks down by who paid, by whether or not anybody was smoking at the table, and by day. But of course, the total number of tips is going to be fairly proportional to the number of meals or to the total bill. So we can see here the total bill. It's also kind of numbers which are hard to look at. What this waiter is probably much more interested in is the tip percentage. And so how do you compute the tip percentage? Is you want the sum over the sum, right? You want the sum of tips over the sum of the total bill. So now we're looking at this in percentages. So now we can kind of see who tips the most. Well, it looks like it's actually kind of the same. It's hard to see, but here you got a 21%. So women at tables where people were smoking on Sundays tended to tip 21%. It's a little hard to see, just a little table of numbers. What you can do is you can sort of get it to light up the important cells. So you switch from a table to a heat map. Boom. So now you can see a little bit more clearly, well, on my screen it's clear. But anyway, you can see that the darker cells are the ones where there are the most here. So you can see that you have 2 cells with 21% tips. That's kind of interesting. So that's, you're kind of starting to see the kinds of things you can do with a pivot table. You can also view this in graphical form. So instead of just looking at a heat map, you can switch this over to, say, a bar chart. Now we've got a bar chart that's showing sort of the tip rates, by day. So we've got Friday in blue, Saturday in red, and so on. And you can see these 2 outliers here jump out visually pretty effectively. We can look at them, sort of just by sex, just by day, flip things around. You can see that you can generate a whole bunch of different types of graphs without too much work at all. In fact, you can switch this to a line chart if you want, and now you've got sort of time series, right? Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Thursday. So it orders things alphabetically. It's not really aware of the dates, but you can make line charts and that kind of thing. So, in 5 minutes, this is basically what a pivot table is and what you can do with it. When you're switching it to a chart mode, it tends to be called a pivot chart. And this is functionality that's been available in Microsoft Excel for decades now, right? And so I built a JavaScript version of this for my own ends, and I'll kind of tell you the story about how I did this. So this is basically what the actual UI looks like. If anybody here is a developer, you might be curious as to how you actually use this library in your project. So I will show you that really quickly. Let's say you wanted, this is basically the simplest possible pivot table example. So PivotTable.js is a jQuery plugin. So all you really need to use it is you create an empty element. In this particular case, it's an element whose ID is output, and you call the pivot method on it. And so the first argument to pivot is going to be the data. And in this case, it's going to be 2 rows of data, one of which represents a blue circle, and the next one represents a red triangle. And the second argument to the pivot function is basically sort of what the table should look like. And so in this case, I said that the rows should be the color, and the columns should be the shape. And that's the table that it gives. So that's how hard it is to use PivotTable.js. You see here, though, that there's no UI. It's just a static table. You can't drag and drop this. That's because I'm calling the pivot method. The pivot method can be wrapped in the pivot UI method, which basically does the exact same thing. Here I'm just calling pivot UI, and now I have a UI. So it's preloaded with the rows and the columns the way I asked for them, but I can drag them around and do different things with them. So that's basically the high-level outline of the library. You can do some other neat stuff with them. So for example, I like giving talks at meetups. So I once gave a talk about Montreal 311 service requests. So anywhere in Montreal, if you pick up your phone and you dial 311, someone at the city is going to pick up the phone and ask you what they can do for you. And you can ask them for various city services. You can ask them about your taxes. You can complain about someone who doesn't pick up their dog droppings. You can ask them about recycling or whatever you want. And they write that down in the database. And I worked with a journalist who asked for a dump of 1 million such requests so we could do some data analysis on it. And so what I did was I wrote up a report here, and I used the pivot table to kind of analyze things. So I had the year of the request, the month of the request, the category of the request, and the borough. And I used this library to basically build a kind of interactive report. So you can see requests by category, you can see requests by borough by category. This projector is a little bit small, but you can see a heat map of sort of by category, by borough. You can see that bulky collection is a big deal in Rivière des Prairies. So you guys can check out this report later on. But you can use the pivot table to present all sorts of information from the very concrete, practical, everyday service requests to what we use it for at work, which is to look at vast amounts of numerical data to find patterns in what our customers' data is doing. So that's the sort of high-level overview of what PivotTable.js is. So back to the story part of things. I like to think that this is a fairly successful project, but I'll kind of tell you why I think so, and let you draw your own conclusions. So it's a little hard to see, I guess, but this project is on GitHub. It's got 1,700 stars. So I guess you should look at your favorite project and see how many stars they have and whether or not that you think this is how well you think that does. I've gotten 55 pull requests, so 55 people took it upon themselves to submit something and say, hey, I want to add this to your library, or I think you should make this modification. This library is on NPM. NPM is the Node package manager, so it's a package manager for JavaScript. And in the last month, it had 569 downloads. So I'm sure a lot of those are robots or automated scripts or something. But people are downloading it and using it. And the thing that I'm kind of excited about is that when you Google JavaScript pivot table, it's the number one link that shows up. So I guess it's kind of the reference, at least in that way. Yep.
Is this a unique case, or have you seen around the web done something like this?
There are other pivot table implementations now that exist as well. But
I was thinking maybe it might be like a D3, but that's visualization.
exactly, and so the charts that you saw here are built using D3.
Huh?
Yeah. So there are other open source libraries, and I'll talk about them in a second, actually. The other sort of measure of success for me is that this project has been integrated into a bunch of different sort of downstream products. So if you use R, you can have a plugin to do this kind of interactive analysis with R. Someone saw my library and thought that would be a cool thing to add to R. I added it. It's a data analysis software package. Yeah, it's just called R. It's the next version after another program called S for stats. What was neat was after I open sourced this, I was actually using a product that we were paying for at work called AHA, which is a requirements management tool. And I go to the reporting tab of AHA and I see my pivot table. And so, a product that I had been paying for, the guys who built that found my pivot table online, thought it'd be a cool addition to their product. And so now I'm using software that I wrote and software that I'm paying for, which is great. Another thing which I think is kind of neat is that someone whom I've never met is actually making money selling PivotTable.js plugins. So he saw this library, he saw that there are things he could add to it that I don't support for a variety of reasons, and so he's bundled them, and he sells $100 licenses for this. So more power to him. That's great. I think it's really neat that I was able to build something that someone else is making money from. I'm totally okay with that. I don't want to make money from it. It seems like a lot of extra work for me. So, this is used by government agencies, by doctors in rural hospitals, by scientists. The other day I got an email from someone who actually just works down the street from where I work. We've never met, but she uses my software and she had a question about it. People from the Ministry of Health and Welfare in British Columbia, which is where I grew up, use this as part of their data warehouse, which is awesome. So I'd say that's fairly successful. More personally, I've had a couple of different billion-dollar so-called unicorn companies call me and see, do you want to work here? Companies that pretty much everyone here has heard of have just called me and said, we found your pivot table online. Do you want to join our visualization team? I'm like, well, I have a job. I like Montreal, but thanks. It's kind of neat. And more importantly, I learned a bunch of things throughout open sourcing this software, which I use in my day-to-day job. So at Datacratic, we support open source software, we use open source software, and we've open sourced the two major pieces of software that we've built. And things I personally learned from open sourcing PivotTable.js have gone into the strategy of how we've open sourced our machine learning database. So overall, I like to think that PivotTable is quite successful, but I'm not going to claim to be as big and famous as some other projects you may have heard of. So how did this all start? So in January 2013, I wanted to present some data that in our product at Datacratic, just to build a user interface. I had been working for a large telecom company for a few years, and there we used Excel all the time, and everyone knew about pivot tables, and we just emailed each other Excel files all the time. So I'd gotten fairly used to using them, and I think they're pretty great. I showed you some kind of neat things you can do with them. So I went and Googled JavaScript pivot table, and in January 2013, when you Googled JavaScript pivot table, you found nothing. There was nothing useful. If you Google JavaScript pivot table now, there's at least 10 different ones, but back in the day, there wasn't anything. So I built the first version of what at the time I was calling it Pivot.js. So pivot in the startup world is what you do when you discover that your business model doesn't work and you need to pivot, go do something else. So I thought it was quite clever. And I thought about open sourcing it, but I didn't because I had other things to do. And Datacratic is pretty open source friendly, but it wasn't like I could spend hours and hours doing it at work. And a couple months later, I was really sad because some other people who had basically the same idea open sourced something that they called Pivot.js, which doesn't work in the same way as mine does. It's not quite as drag and drop, and so I was annoyed that they got out there first and they took the name for what I had called my little project. So anyway, that motivated me to actually put in a little bit of effort, write some documentation, clean up the code a little bit, and open source it. So finally in June, 6 months later, I got around to open sourcing it with a new name. It was going to be called PivotTable.js because Pivot.js was taken. So I pushed it to GitHub. And this is what it looks like. It looks like now. It's just got a bunch of files and a README. And that was basically what it looked like then as well. And I posted it on Hacker News, which is a website basically for startup people. And I got 102 upvotes. It's enough to stay on the front page for a couple days, or for about a day, I guess, and 33 comments. So in the comments, people had questions. Some people were annoyed that I'd called my library PivotTable.js, even though it's written in CoffeeScript. People were outraged. How dare you call it .js? Other people said, well, it compiles down to JavaScript. What do you care? And I was pretty honest about my answer. I wanted it to be the first result when you Google pivot table JavaScript. And if I called it pivottable.coffee, no one would find it. So that's why I called it PivotTable.js. And people also had questions about the performance and the scalability. They said, well, can you really do data analysis in the browser? And I guess I can show you a demo at the end here, but it scales to about 100,000 rows of input, which is pretty reasonable as far as I'm concerned. And if you have a slow machine, it won't scale quite as well. And depending on the type of analysis you're doing, 100,000 rows of input can actually represent vastly more data, right? The 311 analysis that I showed you guys was basically a condensed version of 1.2 million rows of data. So often you don't actually need to load all of the data into your browser to do analysis on a summary of it. So those are the questions people had then, and people still have those questions now. And the answers I gave you are basically the answers I give. So within 1 day of the Hacker News post, someone went on GitHub and created an issue. They found a bug in one of the demos. Within 3 days of the Hacker News post, someone sent me a pull request. They fixed the bug in one of my demos. And so that basically began that way. At first, people, the first pull request, I think the second pull request, that I got was someone who didn't like the fact that I had new lines at the end, spaces at the end of my lines. So he submitted a pull request where he removed the trailing spaces off the end of my line. So okay, sure, why not merge that? People fixed a few bugs with my demos. People made the demos, Internet Explorer compliant. They added doc types and that sort of stuff. That was neat. And then people said, okay, well, I tried using your pivot table in my page, but it doesn't work because your CSS classes clash with mine, or you're using IDs and you should be using classes. And so people in the beginning started submitting little compatibility fixes. And then I got feature requests. I need to do this. Please make it do that. Oh, okay. And I got some how do I questions. This is my favorite. People ask, how do I do this? Like, well, you can't. Sorry. It's not that you aren't getting how, it's just that it's not possible. So this afternoon I tried to figure out, what's the volume of issues and stuff that I get from this. So I open sourced this about 2.5 years ago, and on average, it's about the equivalent of getting one issue or email every weekday for 2.5 years, which is okay. This is kind of my hobby. Some days I get 10 messages, some days I get 0. But this is kind of just what it's boiled down to. So, for this presentation, I tried to sit down and think of how have I approached communicating with this community of people who use this software. So, I've chosen fairly explicitly to work primarily through the GitHub issues system. So, does everyone here use GitHub? Does everyone know what GitHub is? So basically, there's a little tab. You can create an issue, and it just it's like a bug report, but it doesn't say it has to be a bug report. It's just an issue. And through the GitHub wiki. So the wiki is basically like a little website where I can put documentation. And every time I get a question, every time someone raises an issue, I try and look at that question as a failure in my documentation. So if someone asked a question, it means they didn't find the answer in the existing documentation. So not only do I try and answer the question, but then I try and fix the documentation. Like, well, is this not clear? Is it missing? Does it need to be rephrased, repeated? To basically kind of double down and make it so that this question doesn't come up again. Because much as I like this, as much as it's my hobby, it gets pretty boring if you have to answer the same questions over and over. And so one of the things I learned is that, most people don't actually read the documentation. That's okay. I don't really read the documentation either when I use other people's software. But in order to address this, I added copy-pastable examples. Right? People don't read the documentation, but they love to copy-paste stuff. So every time someone asked me a question, I would create a new example, add it to the list of examples, and send them a link to the example. Okay. Now the next guy or girl can find the example and copy paste that and not create a GitHub issue. So over time, I kind of got this loop going where I started accumulating a fair amount of documentation and examples, and I like to think that it's working because there's certain questions that come up over and over because there's a bunch of different ways to ask the question, but overall, there's a bunch of questions I no longer get. So one of the things I also did was I added a frequently asked questions to the wiki. So some people, I'm sure, look at the frequently asked questions and don't ask the questions, and some people ask the question anyway, and I just send them a link to the FAQ and say, as I've documented longer here, no, or yes, or this is how you do it. And then finally, I added a file to my GitHub repository called contributing.md. So that's kind of a neat file. It's a bit of an open source convention to have a file called contributing. which explains to people how to contribute to your project. So creating an issue is considered a contribution in the open source community because you're saying, hey, this is broken, or how do you do this? And so when you add a contributing file to your repo, and I want to show you guys this, what happens is if you try and create a new issue, go to issues here. If you try and create a new issue, GitHub will automatically pop up this little yellow box here and say, please review the guidelines for contributing to this repository. So this is great for me because I get to put my little guidelines here, and people are, there's a good chance that they'll actually see them when they're creating an issue. And so what I say, I say, well, issues are the preferred way to communicate with me. Please don't send me email. People do anyway, and I sort of politely ask them to go create an issue. Why do I do this? Because then the issue is there for other people to find, right? That's me doubling down on trying to build this documentation. If you have multiple questions, please create multiple issues, right? So that we don't have this issue with a million things in it. And please try and explain to me what you were trying to do that didn't work. Or if you want to get a particular output, show me your input so I can help you. And don't ask comments to someone else's issue. Like if there's an issue that was created in 2014 that's been closed since 2014, please don't add a comment with a new question at the bottom of that. That's not helpful. And I also kind of explain to people, well, that when you contribute a pull request to this library, you're basically open sourcing it under the same license as this library, which is an MIT license. You should probably log an issue before sending a pull request so you can sort of chat with me about it. I prefer lots of little pull requests rather than one big one that makes 16 changes so I can think about it. And also, this is a CoffeeScript project, so please send me the changes in CoffeeScript so they're part of the project and not in the downstream JavaScript. So this is something that I guess I have no real way of measuring whether this is working or not, but it makes me feel good to have written all this stuff, and occasionally I point people to this and say, well, this is how I would like to work. So I thought that was kind of something that I wanted to share. Obviously, part of communicating with the community is sometimes having to say no. This is a spare time project for me, just like it's a spare time project for me to come here and talk to you guys about it. So I kind of need to control the scope. Every time I add a feature or I add an option or anything to my PivotTable.js library, it generates new questions, it generates new issues, etc. So I don't want to just kind of keep on adding options for everything under the sun because then more work for me, right? So the way I kind of approach this is I've laid out some pretty clearly defined constraints. For example, this is a client-side library. I'm not interested in building a server-side component for this. And I, if someone sends me a pull request or asks me how do I make this work with a server-side something, I say, well, not with this library. Sorry, that's not what it's for. I only want to have jQuery as a dependency for this library. So anyone who uses PivotTable.js just has to load jQuery. I didn't want to load in 16 other libraries for number formatting and utilities for this and that and underscore and Lodash and all the other different things that you can add. And this makes it easier for me to manage dependencies, and I think makes it more likely that people will install it. And finally, just as an arbitrary constraint, I declared that the core file of PivotTable.js can only be 1,000 lines of CoffeeScript. So it hovers around 950 right now, so if you want to add a feature, you better go shave off some lines off some other feature because I don't want to have to deal with this huge, massive, loaded code base. So I generally, now, I would say it's basically feature complete, 950 lines, I'm staying there. That said, I've generalized the architecture as much as I can to encourage people to, if they have a question, they can extend the library by injecting some code into it rather than forking it or being sad that the library just doesn't do what they want. So for example, the heat maps and the charts, those are all sort of pluggable modules. So one of the questions I used to get a lot is, oh, can you support my favorite charting library, chart.js or HiCharts or Flot or any of the others? And I basically have said, well, here's how I inject D3 as a charting library, so you can add whatever library you want. Some people seem to like that. Some people have, and some people haven't, and that's okay. And then I try not to say no. I try to say sorry, this is currently not supported. It might be later. You can help me by adding it if you want, or here's how you could do this yourself, or here's this other tool which is probably what you're looking for instead of trying to modify PivotTable.js. So. I guess that's how I try and deal with things. Not everybody likes hearing no, but it's okay. So some of the cool things about open source is that other people help you. Other people add a bunch of stuff for free without you asking for it. So when I first released this, it was just basically a CoffeeScript file and a JavaScript file and a README. And I figured, well, if anybody else wants to use this, they can download the JavaScript file, stick it in their project, and do whatever. Apparently, that's very passé. We don't do that anymore. It's out of fashion. What modern developers use is npm or Bower or Browserify or Require.js or any of a whole bunch of different frameworks for managing all of their dependencies. And so, a user one day requested that I package up PivotTable.js as a Bower package. So I'd never heard of Bower before. I went to the website and looked at it. Before I had a chance to do anything, he basically said, oh, by the way, here's how you do it. He sent me a pull request with a little Bower.json file that I can stick in my repo. Said, oh, just click on that button over there and it'll all get automated. And so, okay, he wanted a Bower package. He got a Bower package. Now everybody else has a Bower package too. A few months later, in 1 week, one guy sent pull requests for basically repackaging PivotTable.js using what is now called the universal module definition, which is basically a header that you put at the top of your file that makes it compatible with all of the different ways of loading JavaScript files. That was cool, thanks. He submitted a npm package.json file so I could add it to npm. Oh, super. He submitted an entire build system based on gulp. So, before I used to have to compile the code and move things around and change the versions in the Bower.json file. This guy gave me a whole build system. All I have to do is type gulp minor, and it automatically goes and updates the version in the package files, git tags it, uploads it, notifies it's npm. Cool. And he showed me how to submit it to CDN.js. So CDN.js is the content distribution network for JavaScript. So now anybody can automatically just paste in one little line of code at the top of their file and have access to PivotTable.js. So I didn't do any of that. It's all there if you go look at it, and it drives a lot of traffic to PivotTable.js. People are able to find it. People are able to use it, and someone else did that because they thought it was cool. So I was like, oh, super. And one thing which I learned is basically it taught me a whole bunch of stuff about how to use GitHub better. GitHub tags and releases are kind of at the center of this process. So now when I make a new version of PivotTable.js, my automated build system automatically creates a tag with the right version. It gets uploaded to GitHub. I can go to the releases button, and I can click new release and put some release notes. And so what does that look like? If you go to my PivotTable page here, if you click on releases, there's 22 of them now, and you can sort of see all the different versions and stuff. And people use these, right? Like when they upgrade from one version to the other, they use these. And someone the other day opened up a ticket saying, you made a big change and you didn't document it in your release notes and it broke something in my software. I'm really sorry. Anyway, we got it sorted out, but release notes are very useful, and people in the open source community have come to rely on them for a bunch of things. And the various package managers, so CDN.js automatically looks at your releases when it grabs the latest version to bundle and host for you. NPM automatically, so it doesn't automatically do it, but NPM will use your GitHub tags to determine which version to show and that sort of thing. So who here has never used NPM? Okay. So NPM, if you click on here, it's basically like a repository of a bunch of different libraries that you can use, all written in JavaScript. You can install with npm install. It's a special command that will download it for you. And so this is the pivot table page on npm. So you can see this fun little picture here and the version and all that stuff. Yeah, it's the node package manager. But it's also useful now for client-side libraries as well. So I thought that was kind of a neat thing, and basically these people taught me all about this stuff just because they wanted to use it, and so now my project has it and everybody else can use it too. One of the things that people asked for, which I built fairly early on, is localization. So localization is basically when you make it so that your software can work in different languages. So not everybody speaks English. Ironically, I say this in English in Montreal. So one day I extracted all of the strings where it says totals, all of the names, into locale strings objects, and I created a little number formatting system because people in different countries format numbers differently, so as to make it possible to create these little language packs that you can use to use PivotTable.js in any language. So I created a French language pack, just because this is where I live here in Montreal, and fairly quickly I got pull requests for Spanish, Portuguese. A little bit later I got Dutch, Turkish, Russian, Chinese. I got an open pull request for a Danish one that I got to merge in at some point. So clearly people like using this, and they like using software in their own language, and they appreciate it when you make it localizable. So that the language packs are just like little files that you open up. I'll show you what they look like. Little files that you add. So the French language pack looks like this. It's just an extra little file that defines a render error. This is the text that should be displayed on a render and the name of all the different types of math operations that you can do, and the tables and that sort of thing. So it's not very difficult to define, but someone's got to do it. And I don't speak anything other than French and English, and CoffeeScript. So localization was kind of a neat thing. And then finally, testing. So a couple of people made a couple of snarky comments in the issues to the effect that, oh, you don't have any tests. Where are your tests? Tests. Well, it's a little hard to test user interface widgets. I don't know if anybody's ever tried to test front-end technology. So I went more than 2 years without an automated test system. I would just test things by hand. I would run through all my examples myself and make sure I know what they look like. So if change came along that broke it, I would detect it pretty fast. But eventually I set up a testing framework based on Jasmine. So what I've done is the internal APIs are sufficiently layered that I'm able to unit test all of the different pieces, like all the math, all of the layout, all of the math and the layout, basically, and the data decomposition, without actually rendering it to the UI. So I've defined a bunch of tests that basically say, when you add things up, they should add up. When you format a date, the string should be correct. So I've put together a little suite of 50 tests, and this is basically just a JavaScript file. It's actually a CoffeeScript file that you can run in your browser, and so long as everything's green, it means you haven't broken it. It's possible to break the UI. It's possible to make things purple without test failing, which I would consider breakage. So it doesn't test everything all the way down to the end, but it tests all of the internals. So if anybody's ever concerned about, did I manage to make plus not do sums? Well, no, because I test that. So I eventually got a test system added to it. No one contributed that. I was kind of waiting, kind of hoping someone, I got a build system for free. Maybe I was going to get a test system for free, but no such luck. So before I get into kind of different demos or asking questions, I got some conclusions about open source. First of all, open source can be a really fun and rewarding pastime, which it kind of is for me. But it can also be fairly demanding. People have questions and they want answers, and when you build a useful piece of technology, people want to use it for their jobs, and when they use it for their jobs, they have deadlines, and they would really like you to answer their questions on their deadlines. And that's not always necessarily compatible with it being a hobby, but anyway, you make do. If anybody was looking into open sourcing something, I would recommend that they are explicit about your project goals, about their project goals. Basically, my goal with PivotTable.js is to build a client-side library that's a drag and drop, whatever it says at the beginning, right? 2D pivot table thing, based on jQuery. I don't have any grand designs to make it, a machine learning library, or to have it, replicate all of Excel. So I know what I want it to do, and I've tried to communicate that clearly. And so, I know when to stop, right? I don't have to keep on investing a whole bunch of time into this project, trying to make it something bigger than it needs to be. And that allows me to listen to my users and to occasionally say, okay, yeah, what you're trying to do, this isn't the library for you. Like I'm sure you could make it do this. I'm sure I could make it do this, but I don't think you should. Right? This is a little library that does these things, and if you need to do something different, maybe you want to try that tool over there. But I think it's important to always be open and be polite and sort of keep listening. If I basically said no to every user who came along with a NPM or a build system or whatever, I don't think this library would be as popular as it is. And then finally, as a sort of a general observation, open source is pretty much a social activity. It's not really a technological activity, right? So the amount of code that's in PivotTable.js is about 1,000 lines of code, which is nothing, right? I mean, basically, I could have read out the entire source code to you in the past half hour. It's not that long. But the amount of code there is tiny compared to on disk, compared to the file size of all the documentation, the examples, and the build tools. So the build system is about 20 megs when it's done downloading all of its NPM stuff that it needs to compile CoffeeScript to JavaScript. And all of that pales in comparison to the amount of space taken up by all of my correspondence that I've ever had with anybody about PivotTable.js. I've spent much more time responding to issues, helping people through their problems, explaining to them what PivotTable.js is about, than I have writing any of the documentation or writing any of the code. So, if you're looking to get into open source, it's mostly not about coding. It's mostly about answering your email and helping people use the tools that you've built. So those are kind of my general observations about open source. It's pretty much the end of my scripted presentation. So I'm happy to take questions or give demos or whatever else people want to talk about.
The use cases in industry. I know you showed some examples
I mean, pretty much, any kind of slicing and dicing of data. When I was working at a telco, we used this for, well, not this particular library, but we used pivot tables for project management. So we had projects by region, and we had each project had a given stage that it was at. So we made a little table where you had region down the side and stage across the top, and in the middle you had number of projects in each region. So you could just see how many projects were active in which stage in which region. One of the products that Datacratic offers is an automated advertising campaign management tool. So you want to know how many banner ads you've shown by region by day. Well, you can make a table that shows that. If you want to know, what the click-through rate of your banner ad is by region, by day, by strategy, by size, by site. These are all essentially data sets that you can present using pivot tables. And as you saw, I showed the example with any kind of multi-dimensional data set, whether it's, say, time and space, or category and color, or anything like that, you can represent in a pivot table. Well, I mean, I built this, half and half, I guess, some at home and some at work, partly for solving a problem at Datacratic. And yeah, I mean, we at Datacratic benefit a lot from using open source tools, so we certainly believe in open sourcing stuff as much as possible. And hey, I got a bunch of people who don't work at Datacratic talking about Datacratic. it's good for us. So yeah, no, we're more than okay with this. We encourage it. But it's certainly something you need to check with your employer before you open source anything that you work on at work. In terms of input formats? So the input formats, that's for sure a question I get a lot, so let me show you the documentation. The input formats that are supported, if you go to the wiki, input formats, basically supports CSV files through jQuery CSV, so it basically natively consumes the output of jQuery CSV, which is an array of objects. So if you give it an array of JavaScript objects where the key is the column name or the attribute name and the value is the attribute value, it'll consume that natively. You can also give it something that looks a little bit more like a CSV, which is an array of arrays, where the first array is the headers and every other array is the values, which is much more compact because you're not replicating the headers in every line. You can pass it a function, which it will call, and then that function will call back, injecting rows one at a time. So this is the most general way of injecting data. So if you have any kind of data source, you can wrap that up into a function with a callback and pass in anything you want. So that's kind of the super general way of passing data in. And then the original version of PivotTable.js actually consumed normal HTML tables. So if you pass it a jQuery reference to a table, it will ingest that table itself as its input. So pretty much anything, but JavaScript objects. More questions? Great. Thank you. So I can show you guys the sort of performance demo if you want. If I go to here, the R demos. So there's a data set here, which is basically the prices of 50,000 diamonds. So it's currently downloading the file, and I parse the file. So it's a CSV file. It's parsed. It's in the table here, and you can basically there's 53,000 rows of data in here. And if I want to look at, say, the color, there you go. The clarity, there you go. So now it's aggregated and counted this, and you can look at the average carat by clarity by color. No problem. 50,000 rows in memory. It's going to slow down a little bit when I start making charts, but let's make a scatter chart here of, let's say, price versus carat. So it's starting to slow down a little bit because it's got to draw, 20,000 dots, but there you go, 20,000 dots.
That's to the D3.
And that's D3. Yeah. Awesome. So it's all in CSS, basically. All of the classes that it uses are prefixed by PBT, so it's unlikely to clash in anything else. You just load the CSS file which is provided, and just, I mean, you can make it pretty much any color you want. Some of the it's kind of sensitive to some of the alignments, so you have to be fairly careful. But it is all in CSS. It works. It works with mobile devices with jQuery UI Touch Punch, which basically adds the drag element to clicks. It's not responsive basically at all because when you have a table, you can't really reflow a table, right? When you have a table with 20 columns, you've got 20 columns in your table, so it's going to scroll. It works really well on an iPad, and it works okay on an iPhone, let's say. But your mileage may vary depending on the size of the table you're trying to make. For little tables, it works great. Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. So I mean, it is something that people ask me. People kind of ask me these questions sometimes in GitHub issues, like, how do I make the table smaller? I'm like, well, you can scale it down without making the font smaller. I'm like, try to draw what you want. It's not possible. You can't have, you can't have 100 numbers at a font size of 12 in 15 pixels. It's not possible. So yeah, that's basically what I got. Yeah, so the way that everything that's in here, this is called the renderer menu. So sorry, that's not what I want to do. Let's get back to the tips data set here. Everything here in the renderer menu controls how this will be rendered. So this is the table. You've got a little table bar chart, which makes little bar charts here. The heat map I showed is also a renderer. And then all of the charts here are C3, which is like a charting wrapper on top of D3. So you can write a renderer that uses Canvas instead of SVG, basically. That's kind of a pluggable thing. So I personally support the C3 ones, but enough people ask me for different visualization technologies that I kind of added this indirection layer so that anybody can plug whatever they want in. Yeah, and I like C3 because it's got legends automatically. There are a large number of charting libraries that don't support legends for reasons which are beyond me. So the one big constraint with visualization is that the data object that is passed into the visualization layer is a table, right? It literally is like a JavaScript tree that represents this table. And so there are a lot of types of visualizations where that is not the input. So for a geo type thing, it's not clear how to map this input format onto a map. You could have like names of countries down the side, but that starts to be like very specific. So there's no real general purpose way of mapping like a table of data onto a map. Yeah, it's not really typed. It's all strings and numbers, basically. So the types of charts that are supported here are bar charts, line charts, stacked bar charts, area charts, scatter charts. I have tree maps. Tree maps are kind of neat. Actually, I have a data set. It's out of date now because we've had an election, but I had a Canadian Parliament 2012 data set. And so I was able to make this little tree map. So this is basically the 2012 Parliament as of the last election. And this is kind of funny. The default colors of C3 happen to lay out to be, or D3 happen to lay out to be the right colors for Canadian political parties in this mode. I didn't do it on purpose. But NDP turned out to be orange, and Liberals turned out to be yellow. The Bloc turned out purple, so that's okay. So anyway, this is, and here basically what I've done is just kind of pass the tree directly into a tree map. People often ask me about pie charts. Pie charts are not supported in PivotTable.js because pie charts are essentially a one-dimensional visualization, right? All they show you is how space is how a quantity is divided up one-dimensionally. But pivot table is actually a two-dimensional thing, right? So unless you want to, or actually an n-dimensional thing, so unless you want to have like a sunburst chart or something like that, it's not really possible to map a grid of data onto a pie chart effectively, unless you want to have lots of pie charts. And C3.js doesn't support multiple pie charts, so no pie charts. I don't have any, but they should certainly could be plugged in. Yeah. Donc tu peux désactiver le UI, puis juste générer le graphique. Ouais. Ça, c'est possible. Donc j'ai un exemple de ça. Euh, Ici, il y a... Ah, donc ça, c'est juste un graphique, sans UI. Puis j'ai appelé juste la fonction pivot au lieu de pivot UI. Puis ça cache les éléments. Donc, de cette manière, tu peux utiliser PivotTable.js pour juste reformater les données avant de les donner à un outil de visualisation. Pas nécessairement donner le UI à l'utilisateur. Yeah. So I don't have a built-in way to do it, and in general, that can be kind of tricky. There are a bunch of different libraries out there that basically will serialize the contents of an SVG. Sorry, you can export an SVG to an SVG file, and you can, I think, materialize SVG as canvas and export canvas to PNG. But I felt that this was kind of out of scope for what I was doing. There's kind of a legacy charting thing which I had before, which I don't encourage people to use too much, which is the Google Charts renderers. So there's a full the Google Charts engine, and within Google Charts, if you double click, I think there's a way to save them or export them or something like that. But generally, that's something else you're going to have to bolt on top of that. Export was definitely a feature that people asked me about a lot, and so I added sort of tab separated export. So the export renderer, you can ask for TSV export and then basically copy paste this into something. One of the things that everybody asks me for is, can you export this into Excel? And I think what they mean is, can you turn this pivot table into an Excel pivot table, which is emphatically no, because that would be very difficult. Can you turn the output into an Excel output? Maybe. It's a little bit difficult, and it would be very different based on the version of Excel you use in the operating system, so I stuck with tab separated, basically. So you can take this and paste it into Excel, and it works really well. Okay, so that's basically my talk. Thanks for listening.